There is a man who no longer exists. He had a name, a job, a family, friends who called him the most reliable person they knew. He showed up early to everything. He said yes to everything. He smiled even when something inside him was screaming. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny. He apologized for things that weren't his fault. He made himself smaller in every room he entered, not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked talent, but because somewhere deep in his childhood, a voice had whispered to him that being liked was the same thing as being safe, and so he traded his spine for applause. He traded his identity for approval. He traded his life, one small surrender at a time, for the temporary warmth of people saying, "You're so nice, you're so easy to get along with." That man's name was Marcus, and one Tuesday morning, sitting in a meeting where his idea was stolen, presented by someone else, applauded by the room while he sat nodding in support of the person who had just robbed him, Marcus felt something shift, not break, not crack, shift, like tectonic plates deep beneath the surface. A slow, continental, irreversible movement. He smiled, he clapped, he said nothing. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, and for the first time in 39 years, he asked himself a question he had never dared to ask. What am I actually afraid of? Not the surface answer, not "I don't want to seem difficult," not "I just want things to run smoothly." The real answer, the animal answer, the answer that lives in the body before the mind gets to dress it up in polite language. And what came up from that silence was something ancient and devastating. He was afraid that if people saw who he really was, they would leave, all of them, every last one. And so he had spent 39 years making sure no one ever had the chance to see him clearly. He had constructed an elaborate, exhausting performance of agreeableness, and he had been so good at the performance that he had almost fooled himself. Almost. But there in the quiet of that apartment, the curtain had finally fallen. And what Marcus saw standing in the ruins of his niceness was not a monster, not a villain, not a terrible person. He saw a man who had never once put himself first, a man who had given everything to everyone and saved nothing for himself, a man who was dying of generosity. This is not a story about becoming selfish. This is not permission to be cruel. This is not a manifesto for narcissists who want philosophical cover for their behavior. This is a story about resurrection. This is the audiobook that the version of you who is tired of being everyone's fallback, everyone's option, everyone's emotional support animal while your own needs gather dust in a corner, this is the book that version of you has been waiting for. We are going to walk through 7 Stoic lessons, ancient wisdom that survived empires, survived slavery, survived war and exile and execution. Wisdom forged not in comfort, but in the exact circumstances where being nice would have gotten you killed. Wisdom from men who understood that the deepest form of respect begins not with how you treat others, but with how mercilessly and honestly you treat yourself. And we are going to move through 14 chapters that will not let you go once they have you. Some of what you are about to hear will make you uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is the sound of growth happening. Some of it will make you angry. Even better, anger pointed in the right direction is the fuel of transformation. Some of it will make you grief-stricken, because you will recognize years of your life in these words. Years you cannot get back, years spent performing niceness for an audience that barely noticed and never truly cared. Let that grief come. Let it move through you, and then let it go. Because after the grief comes something extraordinary, something that most people pleasers have never felt in their adult lives. Something so foreign it will feel almost dangerous at first. Freedom. The freedom to be exactly who you are. To say no without a paragraph of justification, to disappoint people without collapsing, to be disliked and discover, to your absolute astonishment, that you are still standing, that the world did not end, that in fact something has begun. Marcus eventually left that apartment. He went back to work the next day, but he was never the same man again. Not because he became hard, not because he became cold, but because he decided, for the first time in his life, that his own respect was worth more than everyone else's comfort combined. What happened to him after that decision is the skeleton upon which these chapters are built. What will happen to you is something only you can write. But it begins here. It begins now. Turn the page if you dare, and let the Stoics teach you what no one ever had the courage to tell you. Being nice is not a virtue. It is a strategy, and it is destroying you. Chapter 1. The Great Pretending. How niceness became your cage, and you called it a personality. Before we go any further, I need you to do something that might feel strange. I need you to think back to the last time you said yes, when every single cell in your body was screaming no. Not the small yeses, not sure I'll grab coffee for everyone while you're already up. The big yes, the one that cost you something, time you couldn't spare, energy you didn't have, a piece of yourself you handed over while smiling because the smile was part of the deal. Maybe it was taking on another project at work when your plate was already full, watching it collapse under the weight while the person who delegated it to you faced zero consequences. Maybe it was showing up to an event you despised for a person who wouldn't have done the same for you in 1,000 years. Maybe it was staying in a friendship that had been feeding off you for so long you'd forgotten what it felt like before the hunger. Maybe it was smaller than that. Maybe it was laughing at a comment that humiliated you because laughing was easier than the silence that would have followed if you didn't. Whatever it was, I want you to sit with it for a moment. Feel the specific texture of that surrender. Because I need you to understand something that the self-help industrial complex has been dancing around for decades, something they soften with buzzwords like boundaries and self-care, because the real language is too confrontational for the wellness market. What you did in that moment was not kind. It was not generous. It was not noble. It was a lie. You presented a version of yourself that did not exist to a person who deserved the truth, and you called it being a good person. And you got rewarded for it. A smile, gratitude, the momentary warmth of being liked. And that reward, that tiny hit of social approval, is what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, and it is the most powerful behavioral trap ever discovered. It is the same mechanism that keeps people pulling the lever on slot machines, not the guaranteed wins, the random ones. The ones that come just often enough to keep you in the game. You have been playing this slot machine your entire life, and you have been losing. Here is what the Stoics understood about human social behavior 2,000 years before social psychology caught up. People do not make decisions based on what is right. They make decisions based on what is comfortable. And the most seductive comfort of all is the feeling of being accepted, being part of the tribe, not being expelled into the cold. This is ancient wiring. This is the reptile brain operating exactly as evolution designed it, because for most of human history, being cast out of the group was not a social embarrassment. It was a death sentence. So your people-pleasing is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is a survival mechanism that has outlived its usefulness by about 10,000 years. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, one of the most powerful men who ever lived, wrote his private meditations not for publication, not for posterity, but for himself. A man who could have had anything, who commanded armies and governed millions, who had every earthly reason to care what people thought of him because what they thought could, in many cases, determine whether they tried to assassinate him. And yet what he wrote, over and over in the privacy of his own mind, was a meditation on this exact problem. He wrote, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." Read that again. We love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. The emperor of the ancient world was sitting in his tent, exhausted from the burdens of empire, writing to himself about the particular madness of valuing what other people think more than what we think. He wasn't writing about peasants. He wasn't writing about the weak. He was writing about himself, about his own struggle with this. Because the trap of external approval does not discriminate based on power or intelligence or success. It is the universal human glitch. The question is not whether you have it. The question is whether you are going to spend your entire life running its program. Now here is where I need to say something that will likely trigger some resistance in you, because it is the kind of thing that sounds harsh until you really look at it. Your niceness is not about the people you're being nice to. It never was. Let me explain this carefully, because it is the keystone of everything that follows, and if you miss it, the rest of the book will be helpful, but not transformative. When you tell yourself the story of your own niceness, the narrative goes something like this. I care about people. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I believe in being kind. I want to make the world a better place by being someone who adds goodness rather than conflict. Beautiful story, genuinely beautiful. Now let me tell you the story underneath that story. You are afraid. You are afraid that if you express your real preferences, your real limits, your real opinions, the people around you will see something in you that they don't like. And if they don't like it, they might leave. They might reject you. They might talk about you. They might decide you are not who they thought you were. And that possibility, that specter of abandonment, is so terrifying that you would rather betray yourself 100 times over than face it once. Your niceness is a shield, not a gift, a shield. And the bitter irony, the Stoics would call this a perfect example of what Epictetus called false judgment, is that the shield doesn't even work, because the people who are drawn to you specifically because of your niceness are not drawn to you. They are drawn to the service you provide. They are drawn to the yes. They are drawn to the lack of friction, the endless availability, the soft place they get to land while never offering you the same. These people do not love you. They love the version of you that never inconveniences them. And the moment you stop providing that, the moment you say no for the first time, or express a preference that doesn't align with their needs, many of them will be gone, and you will interpret their leaving as evidence that you were right to be afraid. But here is what you will have missed. Their leaving was the best possible thing that could have happened to you, because what left was not a relationship. What left was a transaction dressed up in the language of connection. The real relationships, the ones built on genuine knowing, on mutual respect, on the freedom to be difficult and real and complicated without the threat of abandonment. Those relationships do not end when you find your voice. They deepen. They become more honest, more nourishing, more real. Epictetus was born a slave, not a metaphorical slave, an actual slave in the Roman Empire, a man owned by another man with no legal rights, no freedom of movement, no claim to his own body. And yet Epictetus became one of the greatest philosophers in history, not despite his circumstances, but because they forced him to grapple with something that free men could avoid. The question of what is actually yours, not your body, not your circumstances, not other people's opinions, not your reputation, not your social standing. All of those could be taken from a slave in an afternoon. What Epictetus discovered, what he called the only truly free thing a person possesses, was this: the capacity to choose how you respond to what happens to you. Everything outside that capacity is, in his word, externals, and externals are not worth your soul. Now apply this to people-pleasing. Every time you betray yourself to maintain someone else's comfort, you are surrendering the only thing that is actually yours, in exchange for something that was never yours to begin with, their approval. You are trading your sovereignty for their smile, and you are doing this voluntarily. Nobody is holding you at gunpoint. Nobody is threatening your life. You are choosing, in complete freedom, to be your own jailer. That is not kindness. That is a catastrophic waste of the one life you have been given. So what does the alternative look like? It does not look like suddenly becoming aggressive, dismissive, or contemptuous. This is not a binary. The choice is not between being a doormat and being a tyrant. The Stoics would have found both options equally irrational, because both are driven by emotion rather than reason. The doormat is driven by fear. The tyrant is driven by insecurity. Neither is free. The alternative looks like this: a man who knows his own mind, who speaks it clearly when it needs to be spoken, who does not add unnecessary softening or preemptive apology to his opinions, who says no when he means no without 12 paragraphs of justification, who offers genuine care to people he genuinely cares about, without using that care as a performance designed to secure their continued presence. A man who has decided that his own self-respect is the foundation on which everything else must be built, because a building without a foundation is not a building, it is a pile of rubble waiting to happen. Marcus went back to work the day after his awakening, and the first thing he did was different. Not dramatically different, not loudly different, but a colleague stopped by his desk and asked him to cover for a mistake the colleague had made in a report to their manager. The old Marcus would have said yes before the colleague finished the sentence. He would have spent the next week doing cleanup work for someone else's error, resenting every moment of it, and then he would have buried that resentment so deep it would come out sideways 3 months later in some unrelated context. The new Marcus, who was still terrified, who felt the yes rising up from instinct like a trained reflex, paused. He paused for 2 full seconds. He looked at his colleague and he said simply, "No, I can't do that for you. But I can help you figure out how to address it with the manager yourself." The colleague stared at him, surprised, then slightly offended. Then they left. Marcus sat at his desk, shaking. He waited for the world to end. It didn't. 3 hours later, his colleague came back and said, "Hey, I talked to the manager. It was actually fine. Thanks for, pushing me to handle it." Marcus nodded. Inside, something that had been wound tight for 39 years released, just slightly, like the first turn of a bolt that hasn't moved in decades. This is how it begins. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a declaration, not with some grand gesture of liberation. It begins in 2 seconds of silence. It begins with a pause between the stimulus and the response. That pause, which Viktor Frankl also identified as the space where human freedom lives, is where your entire transformation will happen, not in the big moments, in the pauses, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices to be real instead of nice. The Stoics had a practice called the morning meditation, in which they would remind themselves of their core commitments before the day began, not goals, not to-do lists, commitments, values, the things they were going to hold on to no matter what the day threw at them. Here is the commitment you are going to make, not to be less nice. Niceness, in the right context, with genuine intention, is one of the most beautiful human qualities. What you are going to commit to is this. You are going to stop being nice at the expense of being honest. You are going to stop performing peace when you feel conflict. You are going to stop manufacturing harmony at the cost of authenticity. You are going to start being real. And real, it turns out, is far more valuable than nice, because nice is forgettable. Real is unforgettable. Nice earns you tolerance. Real earns you respect. And respect, as we are about to discover, is the only currency in human relationships that actually holds its value. Chapter 2, The Stoic Mirror. What the philosophers saw when they stopped caring what the crowd thought. Here is something they don't tell you about the Stoic philosophers. They were not gentle men. The popular image of Stoicism has been cleaned up for the modern marketplace, smoothed down, made palatable, sold in bite-sized quotes on motivational posters and phone wallpapers. Amor fati, memento mori. Pretty Latin phrases printed over mountain ranges, and none of it is wrong exactly, but it misses the essential texture of what these men actually were. Marcus Aurelius commanded armies. He spent more of his reign at war than at peace, and he was there on the front, not in Rome on a comfortable throne. He watched men die. He made decisions that sent thousands to their deaths, and carried those decisions without the luxury of anyone else's absolution. Epictetus was a slave who had his leg broken by his master, deliberately, casually, as a demonstration of power, and who responded while his leg was being broken, calmly, without rage or tears, by telling his master that the leg would break. And then it did break, and then he said, simply, "Did I not tell you?" Seneca counseled the most paranoid and murderous emperor in Roman history, navigated politics that would have broken lesser men in weeks, was eventually ordered to commit suicide, and did so with the same equanimity he had counseled others to seek. These were not men who had made their peace with life by finding a comfortable corner. These were men who had made their peace with life by staring directly into its most brutal aspects and refusing to look away. That is the Stoicism we are working with here, not the Pinterest version, the real version, the version that was forged in war and slavery and exile and the constant threat of violent death. And the central insight of real Stoicism, the one that all the other lessons orbit around like planets around a sun, is this: the opinion of other people about you is entirely outside your control, and therefore entirely outside what should be allowed to influence your behavior. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is commonly misunderstood to mean that Stoics didn't care about relationships or social life or how they were perceived. That is completely wrong. What the Stoics argued is that you should care deeply about your own character and not at all about what others decide to make of your character, because your character is yours. It is the one thing that, in the words of Epictetus, truly belongs to you. What others decide to think about your character is their business, constructed from their own fears, their own projections, their own stories that have almost nothing to do with you. Consider this through the lens of your own experience. Think of someone who has a negative opinion of you, not a criticism you secretly agree with, a flat-out wrong negative opinion. Maybe someone who thinks you're arrogant when you're actually reserved. Maybe someone who thinks you're cold when you're actually private. Maybe someone who misinterpreted an interaction years ago and calcified it into a permanent judgment. That opinion of you is real, it exists, it affects how that person treats you and talks about you, and yet it tells you absolutely nothing true about yourself. It is a story they are telling about you that has no more power to define you than a story told about you in a language you don't speak. Now expand this. Most of the opinions others hold about you, including the positive ones, the ones you've been working so hard to maintain, are equally constructed, equally separate from your actual nature. The people who think you're wonderful because you always say yes to them are not responding to your genuine character. They are responding to a service. The people who would think less of you if you suddenly started saying no are not seeing you clearly now. They are seeing their own convenience reflected back at them and calling it your personality. The Stoic mirror, what I mean by that, is the practice of replacing the external mirror with an internal one, of asking, not how do I appear to others, but what do I actually think of myself right now? Does this action align with the person I have decided to be? This is not easy. Let me be honest with you. It is genuinely one of the hardest things a social creature can attempt. We are wired for external feedback. Babies respond to faces before almost anything else. The entire architecture of our emotional nervous system is built around reading and responding to social signals. Asking yourself to override that system is not a small request. It is like asking your heart to beat differently. But the Stoics did not say it was easy. They said it was necessary, because here is the alternative. The alternative is a life lived at the mercy of other people's moods, a life where your self-worth fluctuates with the approval you receive, where a kind word from someone inflates you and a harsh word deflates you, where you are perpetually dependent on external weather to determine your internal climate. And that life, as many of you listening to this know intimately, is exhausting. It is a life of constant monitoring, constant adjusting, constant performance. It is a life where you never fully rest because you can never fully stop managing the perceptions of everyone around you. There was a specific moment in Seneca's life that I want to linger on. He was an advisor to Nero. Yes, that Nero. One of the most unstable, violent, and ultimately horrifying rulers Rome ever produced. Seneca knew who Nero was. He was not naive. He watched Nero have his own mother murdered. He watched the paranoid rages, the cruelties, the slow dissolution of a human being into something monstrous. And Seneca stayed. Not from cowardice. He stayed, scholars argue, because he believed that his presence, his counsel, his steady philosophical voice was doing some good, was moderating something that would have been worse without him. He stayed until Nero falsely accused him of conspiracy and ordered his death. And then Seneca, in his final hours, demonstrated something remarkable. He dictated letters. He instructed his friends who were weeping around him to compose themselves, because their grief, while moving, was a response to externals. He pointed out that everything that had happened to him, the fall from favor, the death sentence, the indignity of being killed by the emperor he had served, all of it was external. All of it was outside his control. What was inside his control, what remained his, was his response to it. He died, according to those present, with the same composure he had spent his life teaching. You are not going to be executed by a Roman emperor. Your stakes are lower, but the principle is the same. The moment you decide that your own judgment of yourself is the primary mirror, the moment you demote external approval from the driver's seat to somewhere in the back where it belongs, you will find something waiting for you that you have not felt in a very long time. Peace, not the fake peace of avoided conflict, not the numb peace of repression, the actual peace that comes from being integrated, from thinking one thing and saying it, from feeling one thing and expressing it, from being the same person in the meeting room and in the bathroom mirror. That integration is what the Stoics called virtue, and they considered it the only genuine good. Not pleasure, not money, not fame, not even love, in the conventional sense, virtue, the alignment between what you are and what you do, the refusal to fracture yourself into a public face and a private truth. Marcus had a second moment, about a week after the first. That was harder. A friend, a genuine friend he had known since university, called him out. "You've changed," she said, not warmly. "You're being difficult lately." He had told her honestly that he couldn't make her birthday dinner because he had committed to something else first, something for himself, something he'd been pushing off for months. The old Marcus would have immediately rearranged everything, profusely apologized, found a way to make both things work while destroying his own peace in the process, and shown up to the dinner exhausted and resentful. The new Marcus said, "I know it's not what you wanted. I'm sorry I can't be there. I hope it's a wonderful evening." She hung up. He sat with the discomfort. He didn't try to fix it. He let it be what it was. She called back 4 days later, and she said something that surprised him. "I've been thinking about what you said. I think I've been leaning on you too hard. I think I've been counting on you being available in a way that wasn't fair." He hadn't accused her of any of that. He hadn't needed to. The simple act of holding his ground had created space for her to see herself more clearly. This is what happens when people with genuine regard for you encounter your boundaries. They don't leave, they grow, and your growth invites theirs. The people who leave were never really there for you to begin with. The Stoic mirror reflects clearly, and the clarity the first few times you look into it can be startling. You will see a person who has been bending and shrinking and accommodating for so long that you've forgotten what upright feels like. You will see the toll, the exhaustion carved into the face, the slightly hunched posture of someone who has been making themselves small. And then, if you keep looking, you'll see something else beginning to emerge. The person you were always supposed to be, before the people-pleasing took hold, before the approval-seeking rewired your responses, before you learned that the safest version of you was the version that never made anyone uncomfortable. The person who has opinions and expresses them, who feels things and acknowledges them, who disagrees when they disagree and agrees when they agree, and whose agreement therefore means something because it is not automatic, who has preferences and states them, who has limits and holds them, not aggressively, not combatively, but firmly, clearly, without apology. That person has been in there this entire time. They were just waiting for you to stop asking the crowd for permission to exist. Chapter 3. Epictetus in Chains. The freedom that cannot be taken from you. There is a paradox at the heart of this lesson that I want you to hold. The most free man who ever put his philosophy into writing was a slave, not free in the way motivational speakers mean it, where they had some internal feeling of liberation despite external oppression. Epictetus was legally owned. He could be sold. He could be beaten. He had no say in where he lived, what he did, or how he spent his days. The entire material condition of his existence was determined by someone else. And yet, when you read the discourses, when you sit with the actual words of this man, you encounter something that the most privileged, most successful, most apparently free people in history rarely possess. You encounter a mind that is completely, utterly, immovably at peace with itself. Not because Epictetus had resolved his external circumstances, he hadn't, they were terrible, but because he had achieved something more profound than freedom of circumstance. He had achieved freedom of response, and he will now teach you something that most people never learn. Your people-pleasing, your endless accommodation, your inability to disappoint anyone is not a character trait. It is not who you are. It is a learned response to a perceived threat. And like all learned responses, it can be unlearned, but only once you understand, at the cellular level, what Epictetus spent his entire life teaching. There are things in your control, and there are things not in your control. This is the foundational teaching, the dichotomy of control. It sounds simple. It is not simple. Most people nod at it and keep living as though everything is in their control, or as though nothing is. The actual practice of this dichotomy is one of the most demanding philosophical disciplines ever devised. What is in your control? Your judgments, your intentions, your desires, your aversions, the stories you tell yourself about what things mean, the values you choose to act from, the response you select in the pause between stimulus and reaction. What is not in your control? Your reputation, other people's opinions, other people's feelings, the weather, your physical health to some extent, other people's choices, whether people like you, whether people approve of what you do, the consequences of your honest expression, the reactions of others when you hold your limits. Now sit with that second list for a moment. Everything in that second list you have been expending enormous, exhausting, life-consuming energy trying to control. You have been adjusting your behavior, muting your opinions, suppressing your preferences, betraying your values, denying your needs, all in service of controlling things that are definitionally outside your control. You cannot make someone like you. You can perform behaviors that temporarily increase the likelihood of their approval, but you cannot control their internal state. You cannot make someone think well of you. You cannot guarantee that your niceness will be received as niceness. And in fact, as many of you have experienced, it very often isn't. The people who benefit most from your people-pleasing frequently take it for granted, escalate their demands over time, and then feel inconvenienced when your compliance isn't immediate enough. You have been running yourself into the ground, trying to control an outcome that cannot be controlled. Epictetus would look at this situation and feel something very close to pity. Not contempt, pity. Because he understood, from the inside, from having lived in conditions of genuine external powerlessness, how devastating it is to compound your external lack of control with an internal lack of control. To not only be subject to conditions you cannot change, but to also become enslaved to the need for approval you cannot guarantee. He taught his students a practice called the premeditation of adversity. Before entering any situation, before any interaction where the temptation to people-please might arise, you mentally rehearse the possibility of disapproval. You imagine saying the true thing, holding the honest limit, and watch the other person's face fall. Watch them be disappointed, watch them be upset, watch them leave the conversation displeased. And then you ask yourself a single question: can you survive that? Not philosophically, not metaphorically, literally, physically. If this person is disappointed in you, are you still breathing? Are you still standing? Does the world continue to exist? In nearly every situation where people-pleasers self-abandon, the answer is yes. The disapproval you are so terrified of producing is, in practical terms, survivable. Often it is not only survivable but inconsequential. The person is mildly inconvenienced, the relationship experiences a small friction and then adjusts. You discover, as Marcus discovered, that life continues and often improves on the other side of the honest no. But the people-pleasing brain doesn't know this, because the people-pleasing brain is not operating on accurate data. It is operating on old data, on the data of childhood, when disapproval from a caregiver was genuinely threatening, when being cast out of the family structure had actual survival implications, when making an adult angry was dangerous in ways that making a colleague or friend or partner angry is not. You are responding to current situations with ancestral software. The upgrade Epictetus offers is this: consciously expand the circle of what you consider yours. Your reputation is not yours. Your relationships, in the sense of how the other person experiences them, are not yours. Your image, what others hold of you in their minds, is not yours. Let all of that go. It was never yours. You were only ever borrowing it. What is yours is your integrity, your deliberate choices, the quality of the attention you bring to each moment, the honesty of your engagement with the world, your willingness to be real even when real is uncomfortable. When Epictetus's master broke his leg, the master expected a reaction: fear, pain, begging, the customary performance of a person being physically dominated. And Epictetus gave him nothing, not defiance, not bravado, just calm, just the observation, "I told you it would break," and then presumably the same equanimity while they set the bone. The master wanted a particular response. He did not get it, and his not getting it was, in the most complete sense possible, not Epictetus's problem. You will have your own version of this. Someone will push for a particular response from you, not physical pain, most likely, but the emotional equivalent. They will push for the accommodation, for the yes, for the apology you don't owe, for the retreat from the position you hold. And you will feel the enormous social pressure of that expectation pressing against you like a weight. And you will have a choice. You can give them the response they're pushing for, the response that is not honest, not yours, not real. Or you can, in the words of one of history's most genuinely free human beings, remain entirely and completely your own person. This is not callousness. This is not cruelty. This is the most radical act of self-respect available to you. Because here is what Epictetus understood about freedom that most people miss. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of choice. You will always have constraints: physical constraints, social constraints, financial constraints, relational constraints. The question is never whether you are constrained. The question is whether, within those constraints, you are choosing, or whether you are being chosen for. The people pleaser is always being chosen for. Other people's needs, other people's moods, other people's comfort levels are doing the choosing, and the people pleaser is simply the instrument of those choices. He is not a person making decisions. He is a vending machine accepting coins. The person who has internalized the lesson of Epictetus makes different choices. Not always dramatically different, sometimes just slightly, just at the margin. The 2-second pause before the yes that isn't. The gentle firm that doesn't work for me. The holding of an opinion under social pressure without the need to argue. Just the quiet refusal to fold. Each of these small choices is, in its way, an assertion of freedom. Each one is the slave breaking a link in the chain, not by fighting the master, by deciding, internally, finally, irrevocably, that the master's opinion of him is not a sentence. Marcus was 6 months into his transformation when he had the hardest test yet. A request from his father, a man whose approval he had spent 4 decades chasing. His father wanted him to take on a responsibility within the family business that Marcus had never wanted, had always quietly refused in his passive way, deflecting and delaying and never quite saying no, because saying no to his father felt like the most dangerous thing imaginable. And this time, his father pushed hard, direct, pointed. Marcus looked at him. He felt the old mechanisms activating, the apology reflex, the accommodation machinery, the flood of rationalizations that had served him so well over the decades. Maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe I can manage it. Maybe this is what family means. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe. He felt all of it. He did not run any of it. He said, "Dad, I love you. I'm not going to do that. I've never wanted it, and I still don't." "I know that's not what you want to hear." His father was furious. Their relationship was difficult for 4 months. There were dinners that ended early and phone calls that were short, and a particular brand of cold politeness that fathers use when they are too proud to express hurt directly and so express it as distance instead. Marcus sat in that difficulty without filling it, without calling to apologize, without manufacturing reasons to see his father that were really just attempts to smooth over the friction. He let the 4 months be what they were. And then it became, for the first time in Marcus's memory, real, because his father, who was also a complicated person with his own wounds, began, slowly, to encounter his son as an actual person rather than a reflection of his own desires. A conversation happened, halting at first, then less so. His father said things he had never said before, not easily, but genuinely, and Marcus said things back that were also genuine. And between the two genuine things, something new was built, not the old comfortable structure of compliance and approval, something sturdier and stranger and more true. And actual persons, once you've recovered from the shock of their autonomy, are far more interesting to love than extensions of your own will. What Epictetus gives you is permission to occupy your own life fully, from edge to edge, without leaving any part of the territory unvisited out of concern that claiming it might inconvenience someone else. Permission to be, in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, yourself, and to discover, in the process, that the self you have been hiding from everyone was not the problem. The hiding was, Chapter 4, the secret chapter, the thing nobody talks about with people-pleasing. I am going to tell you something that has been left out of every book, every podcast, every therapy session, every conversation about people-pleasing you have ever had. You are getting something from it. Right now, today, you are receiving a benefit from your people-pleasing that is so seductive, so deeply woven into how you experience yourself, that naming it is going to feel like an attack. But it is not an attack. It is the most necessary thing I can offer you. Because until you see this clearly, every technique, every Stoic lesson, every earnest self-improvement effort will be a surface renovation on a structure whose foundation you have never examined. Here it is. People-pleasing makes you feel good about yourself. Not just safe, not just liked, good. It gives you a sense of identity built around a flattering self-image. You are the reliable one, the selfless one, the one who holds everything together, the one who will never let you down, the martyr, the giver, the anchor. And that identity, that role, that story you tell about yourself is profoundly, addictively pleasurable. Because the alternative, the identity that exists beneath the people-pleaser, the one you are protecting with all this niceness, might have needs, might be angry sometimes, might be selfish sometimes, in the healthy sense, in the sense of having preferences and pursuing them, might disappoint people, might be complicated and contradictory and imperfect in ways that don't fit the story of the reliable, selfless, always available person you've cast yourself as. The people-pleasing is not just protecting you from other people's disapproval, it is protecting you from your own. This is the secret, and this is why it is so hard to change. Not because change is complicated, not because the techniques are difficult, but because part of you, a significant part, is invested in the identity of being nice, and any challenge to the niceness feels like a challenge to who you are. The Stoics had a word for this: attachment. Not in the Buddhist sense, though the principle overlaps. Attachment to a role, to an image, to a story. They identified it as one of the primary sources of human suffering because attachment, by definition, is a form of dependency, and dependency is a form of vulnerability. You are not just dependent on others' approval, you are dependent on your own self-image as the person who deserves approval. And that self-image is as much a prison as any external chain. There is a darker layer. People-pleasing for many of us is also a form of control, not conscious control, not cynical manipulation, though in some cases it drifts that way. But the dynamic of the chronic nice person is frequently one in which the pleasantness is a technique, however unconscious, for managing other people's behavior. If I am unfailingly accommodating, the unconscious logic runs, then you cannot have any legitimate grievance with me. If I never say anything to upset you, you cannot leave me. If I absorb every request without complaint, I have made myself indispensable. If I am always the one who gives, you are always the one who owes, and that debt is a kind of security. The psychology literature calls this anxious attachment. Stoicism calls it something harsher. It calls it a false relationship with reality, a refusal to accept that the only genuine security is the security of your own integrity, and that any security built on other people's indebtedness to your service is no security at all. It is a house of cards that requires constant maintenance and collapses the moment you stop building. I want you to think about the person in your life whose approval you work hardest to maintain, the one whose displeasure costs you the most sleep. Now ask yourself, do you respect that person? Not do you love them, not do you care about them. Respect. Do you look at how they treat you, the dynamic that has developed between you, and feel genuine respect for the structure of that relationship? Do you feel in that relationship like two people of equal worth engaging with genuine care for each other's well-being? For many of you, the answer is no, and here is what that means. You are working the hardest for the approval of people you don't even genuinely respect. You are paying the highest price to people who have the least claim to it, because the people who truly care about you don't require your constant performance. They don't need you to be unfailingly pleasant. They are not depending on you to never have a bad day or a sharp word or a need that inconveniences them. Real love does not require that kind of maintenance. The relationship that requires endless niceness to survive is not a relationship, it is an audition, and you have been in audition for so long, you've forgotten you already got the part. Here is the transformation this chapter is asking of you. It requires examining your investment in the people-pleasing identity, asking honestly what you get from it, what story it lets you tell about yourself, what it protects you from having to be, and then, with that knowledge, making a different choice. Not the choice to become selfish or difficult, the choice to build your self-image on something sturdier than approval. The Stoics suggested that the foundation of genuine self-respect is what they called the ruling faculty, the rational, reflective part of you that can assess your own behavior honestly, not the emotional part that needs validation, the part that knows the difference between a genuinely good act and a self-serving performance of goodness. That part, if you cultivate it, if you develop the habit of checking in with it rather than with the people around you, becomes the most stable foundation a person can build on, because it does not require external weather. It does not need the sun to be shining. It does not collapse in the rain. It is there in the silence, in the dark, when no one is watching, when there is no applause. That is the person Epictetus was. That is the person Marcus Aurelius was working toward in those private meditations. That is the person you are capable of becoming, but you have to be willing to see what you're actually doing first. Before the transformation, there is the honest inventory. Before the building, there is the examination of the ground. This chapter is the examination. What you build next is up to you. Chapter 5, Memento Mori. You are going to die, and that changes everything about how you should live. I want you to stop, physically if you can. Wherever you are, however you're moving through the world right now, I want you to stop and sit with what I'm about to say. You are going to die, not eventually, in some abstract future way that allows you to treat it as irrelevant. You are going to die, and you do not know when, and the life you are currently living, today, this week, this year, is part of a finite total that you cannot know and cannot extend indefinitely. The Stoics were obsessed with death, not morbidly, not with depression or despair, with clarity, with what they called the practice of memento mori, which simply means remember that you will die. Marcus wrote about it repeatedly. Seneca built entire letters around it. Epictetus referenced it as the ultimate check on all excessive attachment. They were not trying to be dark. They were trying to cut through the one illusion that makes all other illusions possible, the illusion of unlimited time. Because here is what unlimited time does to a person pleaser. It makes the cost of self-betrayal seem manageable. If you have unlimited time, then sure, spend this year saying yes to everything, absorbing every request, betraying every preference. You can always start living for yourself later when things settle down, later when the kids are older, later when your position at work is secure, later when you've proven yourself sufficiently, later when people have accepted you enough that you can afford to occasionally be real, later. And then Seneca says something that ought to feel like cold water. He says, you act as if time is limitless. It is not. And you are spending it in the service of other people's comfort while your own life waits, patient and increasingly short. The radical reframe Memento Mori offers is this. If you knew you were going to die in 1 year, would you spend the next 12 months managing everyone else's approval? Would you spend your remaining days carefully performing agreeableness? Would the inventory of your life, when you took it at the end, consist of, well, everyone always liked me, and would that be enough? For most people, the answer is immediately no, and yet they continue to live as though the answer is yes. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with this awareness, and I want to name it directly. When you fully absorb the idea that your time is finite, when you really let it in rather than processing it as an intellectual concept and moving on, you will likely feel something about the time already spent, about the years in the service of managing other people's emotions, about the authentic experiences you declined, about the honest things you swallowed, about the version of yourself that has been waiting increasingly impatiently to actually live. That grief is real and it is valid, but it is also not useful if you dwell in it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as a dismissal of the past, but as a practical recognition that the only time in which action is possible is now. The time already lost is gone, and no amount of mourning returns it. But the time from this moment forward is still yours, still available, still capable of being lived differently." The Stoic response to Memento Mori is not despair. It is urgency, not the anxious urgency of someone trying to do everything at once, but the clean urgency of a person who has stopped pretending that tomorrow is guaranteed. The urgency that makes you ask, before agreeing to something that diminishes you, whether this is how you want to be spending the time that you have. Seneca, in his magnificent essay on the shortness of life, made an observation so precise it is almost violent. He said that most people complain that life is short, but life, he argued, is not short. It is long enough for a person who uses it well. The problem is not the length of life. The problem is the quantity of it that is wasted. Wasted in trivialities, in the endless maintenance of other people's comfort, in the postponement of your actual self to some future date that never arrives. People-pleasing is one of the most efficient methods ever devised for wasting a life, because it consumes enormous energy, not just in the act of accommodating, but in the management of the internal conflict that accommodation creates. Every time you say yes when you mean no, your nervous system registers the dissonance, not loudly, not always consciously, but it registers it, and that registration costs energy, carries weight, accumulates over time into a persistent low-grade exhaustion that people-pleasers frequently describe as, "I don't know why I'm always so tired. I don't do anything particularly demanding." But they do the most demanding thing imaginable. They live divided lives. One face in, one face out. One truth held, one truth performed. The energy required to maintain that division, to keep those two selves from colliding, is extraordinary. It is why people who finally stop people-pleasing almost universally describe a sense of physical lightness. Not metaphorically, actually lighter, like they have put down a weight they had carried so long they stopped noticing it. Marcus, 2 years into his transformation, had what he described as the most frightening and freeing moment of his life. He had a medical scare, not life-threatening as it turned out, but for 72 hours while waiting for test results, he genuinely believed he might be seriously ill. And in those 72 hours, he found himself doing something involuntary and revelatory. He took inventory, not of his finances or his affairs, but of his life as lived. The experiences, the relationships, the choices, the time. And what he found, sitting in that hospital waiting room with his phone turned off for once, was that the proudest moments of his recent 2 years were not the moments he had been well liked. They were the moments he had been most himself. The conversation with his father, the no he had held with the colleague, the dinner he hadn't attended, the friend who had eventually called back, the growing sense that he knew who he was. And what he found in the years before that was a blur of performed pleasantness that he could barely distinguish from one instance to the next. Because pleasantness, it turns out, has no texture. It all feels the same. But authenticity has texture. Authenticity is individual and memorable and irreplaceable. He was given the all clear. He walked out of the hospital and stood on the street for a long moment. And he made a decision, not for the first time but more deeply than ever before, that he was going to live as though the clock were audible. Because it is. We have simply learned to tune it out. The Stoics insisted on tuning it back in, not as a source of anxiety, but as a source of liberation. The awareness of death, properly integrated, does not make you panic. It makes you precise. It makes you ask, before every significant expenditure of your finite energy, whether this is where you want to be spending it. And for a people pleaser, that question, asked honestly and repeatedly, begins to dismantle the machine. Because when you hold the knowledge of your mortality alongside the request being made of you, when you ask, if I had 1 year left, would I spend any of it on this? The answer clarifies remarkably quickly. Not always no, sometimes yes. Sometimes the thing being asked of you is genuinely worth your time and energy and care, and when it is, you give it wholeheartedly, not from fear but from genuine choice. And that giving feels entirely different from the compulsive accommodation. It feels like a gift rather than a tax. The memento mori practice for people pleasers is not about making every decision a life or death calculation. It is about occasionally returning to the question that restores perspective. The question that reminds you of the actual scale on which your life is being lived. And that question is simply this: when this is over, when your time here is done, and you look back at how you spent it, what will you want to have been true about you? Not what will others say, not what will your reputation have been. What will you want to have been true? That answer, whatever it is for you, is your compass. Follow it every single day, because every single day is the one you have been given. Chapter 6. The discipline of desire, wanting what you actually want, instead of what you think you're allowed to want. There is a question that people pleasers almost never ask themselves. What do I actually want? Not what do I want to appear to want. Not what is it acceptable for me to want in this situation. Not what would the people around me prefer that I want. The actual, unfiltered, uncensored, genuine preference that lives beneath all the accommodation and the performance. Most chronic people pleasers have so thoroughly suppressed this question that when it arises, they feel a flutter of anxiety rather than a flutter of recognition. The desire feels dangerous, selfish, presumptuous. Who am I to want something? Who am I to have preferences? What right do I have to need something that might be inconvenient for someone else? The Stoics called the capacity to identify and appropriately pursue what you genuinely want the discipline of desire, and they considered it not a luxury, but a fundamental component of a well-lived life, not because desire is always good or always right or always to be pursued without wisdom, but because desire, properly understood, is information. It tells you something about your nature, your values, your genuine direction. The person who has lost contact with their desires has also lost the most essential navigation system they possess. They are moving through life based entirely on the terrain of other people's preferences, without any internal compass of their own, and they are perpetually lost, perpetually exhausted, perpetually resentful in ways they don't understand because they have buried the source of the resentment so deep they can no longer trace it to its root. Marcus noticed this in year 3. He had been making changes, gradually, carefully, with the kind of deliberate attention the Stoics called prosoc, mindful attention to the self. He had been saying no more often. He had been holding his limits with more consistency. He had been allowing himself to disappoint people and surviving it. And something interesting had been happening. He was discovering what he actually liked. It sounds absurd to say that a 39-year-old man had to discover what he liked. But the reality for many people-pleasers is exactly that. When you spend decades organizing your preferences around what other people prefer, you lose track of your own. You know what music your partner likes. You know what food your colleagues will enjoy at the team lunch. You know what kind of conversation your mother finds comfortable. But ask you what you, specifically and individually, would choose in a neutral context, and there's a pause, a searching look. I don't know, what do you think? The rebuilding of genuine desire is one of the most quietly profound aspects of the people-pleasing recovery, because here is what happens when you find your way back to it. You stop being generic. You stop being the agreeable blur. You develop the sharp edges that real personality requires. You start saying things like, "No, I don't want Thai food, I want Italian, and here's exactly what I want." And that specificity, that unapologetic willingness to be a person with actual preferences, is profoundly attractive to people who have genuine respect for personhood, and it is profoundly unsettling to people who have been relying on your blankness. The Stoics were careful to distinguish between natural desires, the genuine, organic preferences and needs of a person, and false desires, the ones manufactured by the need for approval, status, or comfort. They were not arguing that all desire is equivalent or that you should pursue every impulse. They were arguing that the first step in the discipline of desire is to know which is which, to have enough self-knowledge to tell the difference between wanting to help someone because you genuinely care and wanting to help someone because you need them to think well of you. That distinction is the foundation of integrity, because help given from genuine desire is a gift. Help given from the need for approval is a trade. And trades, when the terms aren't explicitly stated, always breed resentment on both sides. The giver resents the receiver for not being grateful enough. The receiver, often unconsciously, resents the giver for the invisible debt the giving creates. Genuine desire, offered freely, creates none of this. It creates something entirely different. It creates connection, real connection, the kind that doesn't require management or maintenance, because it is built on the actual rather than the performed. There is a practical exercise from Stoic practice that I want to give you here. It is derived from Marcus Aurelius's journaling practice and Epictetus's instruction on self-examination. At the end of each day before sleep, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what did I do today because I genuinely wanted to? Not because I thought I should. Not because someone needed it from me, because I, independently and freely, wanted to. Second, what did I do today to avoid someone's disapproval? Be specific, be honest. Don't dress it up as generosity if it was fear. Just name it. Third, where was the difference between those 2 categories largest? What was the biggest gap between what I genuinely wanted and what I actually did? Do this for 30 days. What you will accumulate in 30 days of honest self-examination is the most accurate map of your people-pleasing patterns you will ever have. Not a theory, not someone else's analysis of your psychology, your own data, gathered from your own life, in your own voice. And what you do with that map is the next step. You choose one thing, just one, per week, where you close the gap, where you bring your behavior into alignment with your actual desire rather than with your managed performance of appropriate behavior. Not everything at once. That's not Stoic. That's not how durable change works. The Stoics were explicit about this. Transformation is not a single dramatic event. It is the accumulated weight of thousands of small, deliberate, right choices. Virtue, as Aristotle taught and the Stoics extended, is a habit. It is not a feeling. It is a practice. You practice, day by day, small choice by small choice, closing the gap. And one day you wake up and the gap is small, and another day it is smaller still, and eventually there is almost no gap, almost no distance between the person you perform for others and the person you actually are. And on that day you will experience something that most people spend their entire lives searching for without knowing what it is. You will experience the relief of being exactly one person, just one, whole. Chapter 7. Amor fati. Love what happens, even when it includes being disliked. This is the hardest lesson, not intellectually. Intellectually, it is perhaps the simplest. It is 4 words in Latin: amor fati. Love your fate. Love what happens, not accept reluctantly, not tolerate with gritted teeth. Love your... It is the hardest because it asks something of us that cuts directly against one of the deepest grooves in the human nervous system. It asks us to experience someone else's negative response to us and not immediately attempt to repair it. To sit in the discomfort of disapproval without reaching for the tool that has always numbed it, accommodation. To, in some sense, love the discomfort itself, or at the very least, to find it useful, to mine it for what it reveals. Nietzsche, who loved the Stoics despite his public ambivalence about them, turned this concept into his most passionate philosophical commitment. He wrote about it as the supreme formula for human greatness, not just accepting what happens, but wanting it. Not just enduring what is difficult, but discovering that difficulty is, in retrospect, always the mechanism of the deepest growth. And for people-pleasers, being disliked is the great difficulty, the one they have organized their entire lives to avoid. Amor fati says, what if you stopped organizing your life around avoiding that? What if, instead of treating dislike as a catastrophe to be prevented, you treated it as information to be processed, and sometimes, crucially, evidence that you are doing something right? Because here is something that the most respected people in every field, in every culture, in every era have in common: they are not universally liked. They cannot be. Because the same qualities that earn them genuine respect, the willingness to hold positions under pressure, to say difficult truths, to decline requests that violate their values, these qualities inevitably generate friction with the people who want them to be otherwise. And friction generates dislike. The person who is universally liked has made one of 2 choices. They are either a person of such extraordinary warmth and such rare wisdom that they manage to be authentic and universally beloved, a category so small it barely exists outside of saints. Or, far more commonly, they are a person who has made themselves so agreeable, so frictionless, so carefully and consistently non-threatening that they have essentially ceased to exist as a distinct person. You cannot dislike what isn't there. The person-pleaser has chosen the second path, and in doing so they have achieved the goal. They are liked, but they have achieved it by a method that destroys the thing that makes being liked meaningful. Because when everyone likes you, but everyone likes the performance and not the person, the liking is hollow. You know it is hollow. And that hollowness, that awareness that the warmth directed at you is directed at a constructed image rather than at you, is one of the loneliest feelings available to a human being. Amor fati invites you into a different relationship with your own experience. It says, the friction is not a bug. The friction is the feature. The moment someone is displeased with you for being exactly who you are, for holding a position you genuinely hold, for declining something that genuinely conflicts with your values, that displeasure is not a failure. It is evidence of the most fundamental form of success available to a person. You are real. You exist in your own right. You have edges, you have substance. You cannot be moved by pressure. You are not what everyone needs you to be. You are what you are. And that, in a world of managed performances, is genuinely rare. Marcus Aurelius wrote about encountering criticism and finding in it a kind of gift. Not because the criticism was always right. Sometimes it was right, and then it was useful. And sometimes it was wrong, and then it was also useful, because it confirmed that the person criticizing him was responding to something other than the reality of who he was, and could therefore be held more lightly. Either way, the criticism taught him something. The people-pleaser has been treating every criticism, every expression of displeasure, every moment of friction, as a crisis to be resolved immediately at whatever cost. Marcus learned to treat it as a teacher who sometimes tells you something useful and sometimes reveals their own limitations, and either way, you are richer for the lesson. This is where amor fati becomes practical. When someone is displeased with you because you held a genuine position, the Stoic response is not indifference, it is honest self-examination. You ask, is this criticism accurate? Am I actually behaving badly in some way? Is there something here I should hear? And if the answer is yes, you adjust, not from the pressure but from your own honest reckoning with the truth. And if the answer is no, if the displeasure is a response to your authenticity rather than your failings, then you let it be. You do not rush to repair it. You do not apologize for being real. You allow the other person to feel what they feel, trusting that genuine connection, if it exists between you, will survive the friction. And if it doesn't survive, then amor fati says, love this too. Because the relationship that cannot survive your authenticity was not a relationship with you, it was a relationship with your performance. And when the performance ends, the audience that was only there for the show will leave. And the people who remain, the ones who can look at the real you, the complicated, sometimes difficult, always honest version, and choose to stay, those people are the most precious thing you will ever have. Marcus, in year 4, had a friend leave, not dramatically, not with a confrontation. She simply drifted away, returned texts more slowly, declined more invitations, and eventually they went from close friends to occasional acquaintances to people who ran into each other with warmth but no real depth. And Marcus, who would have once chased that drifting friendship back across the room, who would have exhausted himself asking what he'd done wrong and how he could fix it, let her go. And he missed her. He genuinely grieved the version of the friendship that had existed, but he noticed something else. The friendship had existed primarily in the context of him being extremely available and extremely agreeable. As he had become less of both, the friendship had receded, and that told him, without anyone having to say it directly, that the friendship had been oriented around his service rather than his self. The grief was real, but so was the clarity. Amor fati, love this too, because on the other side of that loss was space. Space that filled over the following months with connections built on different terms, on honesty, on mutual care that didn't require performance, on the particular pleasure of being known rather than liked. You will have losses. This is not a painless path. Anyone who tells you that becoming your authentic self is a simple, joyful, cost-free process is selling you something. There are losses on this road. People who were comfortable with your people-pleasing will not all be comfortable with your authenticity. Some of them will leave, and some of those departures will hurt. The Stoics would say, this is the price of virtue, and it is worth it. Not abstractly, concretely, actually, in practice. The relationships you build on the other side, the ones built on the actual you, are qualitatively different from anything available to the person-pleaser. They are deeper, richer, more sustaining, more real. They are worth the price. Love your fate, even the parts that cost you, especially those parts. Chapter 8. The Iron Fence. Building limits without apology, without guilt, without negotiation. Stop apologizing for your limits. I need to say that again, more slowly. Stop apologizing for your limits. Not because your limits are always reasonable, not because every no is automatically justified, but because the reflexive apology that precedes every limit you set is not an expression of consideration for others. It is a preemptive devaluing of your own authority. It says, before you have even expressed what you need, I am sorry for needing anything at all. I am sorry for taking up this space. I am sorry for being a person with edges. And when you apologize for your edges, you invite others to push against them. Because an apologetic no is not a no, it is a negotiating position. It is an invitation to convince you. It says, I feel bad about this, which means the right argument, the right emotional pressure, the right display of disappointment might move me. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in what became one of the most extraordinary collections of letters in human history, wrote about the importance of what he called firmness of purpose. He wasn't writing about stubbornness. He was writing about the particular strength of a person who has decided what they think and says it without apology and then holds it without apology, not without reconsideration. If new evidence or a genuinely compelling argument arises, a wise person reconsiders. But reconsideration driven by evidence is different from capitulation driven by pressure. The people pleaser cannot tell the difference between these two, because they have trained themselves to experience social pressure as though it were evidence. Someone's displeasure registers as a signal that they are wrong. Someone's persistence in a request registers as a signal that the request must be legitimate. Someone's escalating emotion registers as a signal that accommodation is overdue. None of that is true. Social pressure is not evidence. Displeasure is not evidence. Persistence is not evidence. Emotional escalation is not evidence. These are emotional events that deserve to be acknowledged and then assessed on their merits, not reflexively appeased. The iron fence is a metaphor I want to offer you for what a genuine limit looks like. Not a wall, a fence. You can see through it. You are not hiding behind it. It does not say, there is nothing here. It says, here is where my territory ends and yours begins. And that line is real and it is permanent, not because I am unwilling to care about you, but because the line is not about you. It is about me, about who I am and what I can offer, and what I need to maintain my own integrity. A fence is not an act of war. It is a declaration of self, and the Stoics would add, it is a gift to the people on the other side of it. Because when your limits are clear, people can orient around them accurately. They know where they stand. They are not constantly testing to find where you will break. They are not unconsciously escalating because your limits have been so consistently soft that they have no confidence in them. When you hold an iron fence, you create safety, not just for yourself, for the relationship. Here is something counterintuitive that research on interpersonal relationships confirms, and that the Stoics would have identified through pure reasoning. People who have clear, consistent limits are trusted more than people who don't. Think about this in your own experience. The people you trust most, not the people you like most, not the people who are nicest to you, but the people you trust, the ones you would go to in a genuine crisis, the ones whose word means something, these people almost certainly have clear limits. They say what they mean what they say. If they say yes, they mean yes. If they say no, they mean no. You know where you stand. The people pleaser, despite their exhausting efforts to be reliable, is actually one of the least trusted people in any social system, because everyone who has been around them long enough knows that their yes is not reliable, that it will be followed eventually by resentment or by a quiet withdrawal, that it might not hold under pressure from a different direction, that the compliance is conditional in ways that aren't stated. The people pleaser's niceness, however sincere in the moment, undermines the trust that genuine reliability requires. Clear limits build trust. Endless accommodation destroys it. The practice of the iron fence is this: when someone makes a request of you, pause before responding. In that pause, ask one question: do I genuinely want to do this, or am I being moved by the pressure to accommodate? If you genuinely want to do it, say yes cleanly, without qualification, without the performance of reluctance that people pleasers sometimes use to make their yes seem more valuable. If you don't genuinely want to do it, say no clearly, not with a paragraph of justification, not with 3 apologies and a long explanation of your circumstances, just, "That doesn't work for me," or, "If the relationship warrants more, I'm not going to be able to do that." Full stop. Then hold the fence, because the test of the iron fence is not the first moment. It is the moment of pushback. It is when the other person expresses disappointment or frustration, or invokes guilt, or escalates emotionally, or repeats the request more forcefully. In that moment, the old mechanism will activate. The urge to give ground will be powerful and immediate. The Stoic practice in that moment is to return internally to the question of whether anything new has been offered, has new information been provided, has a genuinely compelling argument been made, or has the only thing that changed been the emotional temperature in the room. If it's only the emotional temperature, hold the fence, not coldly, not dismissively. You can acknowledge the emotion without yielding to it. "I understand you're disappointed. My answer is still no." This is not unkind. This is honest. This is treating the other person as a capable adult who can survive not getting what they want from you. Because here is the thing about the people around you. Most of them are more resilient than you are giving them credit for. The emotional displays that trigger your accommodation instinct are real emotions, but they are not emergencies. They are the natural responses of a person whose request has been declined. They are not signals that you have done something wrong. They are simply feelings that the other person is experiencing. You are not responsible for managing those feelings. You are responsible for your own behavior. Be clear, be kind, be honest. Hold the fence and watch. Over time, as the relationships in your life begin to shift, as the transactional ones show themselves for what they are, as the real ones deepen in ways that were impossible when your constant accommodation made real encounter unnecessary, the iron fence is not a wall. It is the shape of you, clearly visible at last. Chapter 9. The Contemptible Mirror. Why you attract what you tolerate and repel what you need. There is a law in human relationships that is so consistent and so reliable it functions almost as physics. You teach people how to treat you, not with words, not with speeches about what you deserve or what you need, with behavior, with what you consistently tolerate and what you consistently decline, with what you absorb and what you push back on, with the standard you hold in practice, regardless of what you say about it in theory. Every relationship in your life is in part a record of what you have taught. This is a confronting truth for people pleasers, because if the above is accurate, and the evidence is substantial that it is, then the patterns of treatment you have been experiencing, the taking for granted, the demands that escalate, the people who push harder the more you accommodate, are not accidents. They are not the bad luck of being surrounded by difficult or inconsiderate people. They are, at least in part, the predictable outcome of what you have consistently taught. This is not blame. I want to be very clear about that. Teaching people to take advantage of you is not a conscious act. You did not sit down one day and decide to become a doormat. You were responding to fear in the best way you knew how, in the way that had worked before, in the way that felt safe. You have nothing to apologize for in how you arrived here, but you have everything to gain from seeing it clearly. The Stoics called this kind of unsparing self-examination proso, and they considered it not self-criticism but self-knowledge, the most useful knowledge available to a human being, because you cannot change the pattern you cannot see, and the pattern here is this: your tolerance level is a signal to the people around you about your valuation of yourself. When you accept treatment that diminishes you, you are communicating not in words but in the language that behavior speaks, that you believe you deserve to be treated that way, and people respond to that signal, not always consciously. Often they are simply responding to the context you have created. If someone learns that they can request anything from you and you will never say no, they will keep requesting. This is not malice, this is human psychology. We push until we hit a wall, and if there is no wall, we keep pushing. Not because we are terrible people, but because we are people. and people need walls to orient around. You have been failing the people who take advantage of you, not by being too nice, but by depriving them of the resistance they needed to develop their capacity for reciprocity. This sounds wild, I know. Stay with me. A child who is never told no develops into an adult with a profound incapacity to tolerate not getting what they want. The parents who said yes to everything were not generous. They were, in their excessive accommodation, genuinely harmful. They deprived the child of the essential developmental experience of encountering a limit and learning to cope with it. What is true for children is also true, in a less extreme way, for adult relationships. The person who is never told no by you, who finds in you an inexhaustible source of accommodation, is not growing in their capacity for reciprocity. They are atrophying. And you, in your endless niceness, are enabling the atrophy. The Stoic concept relevant here is what Marcus Aurelius described as the social nature of virtue. Virtue, he argued, was not just about individual character. It was about the character of your relationships. A person of genuine virtue was not simply kind in isolation. They were honest in the context of relationship. And honesty in relationship sometimes means saying something difficult that the other person needs to hear. Your no is sometimes the most honest, most caring, most actually virtuous response available to you. Now, what about what you attract? Here is the part that is even more confronting. Chronic people pleasers frequently have a pattern not just of being taken advantage of by others, but of being specifically drawn to the kind of person who benefits most from their accommodation, of finding themselves in friendships and romantic relationships where the dynamic is heavily weighted toward giving on their part and receiving on the others. Why? Because the person who needs a lot of giving finds the people pleaser immediately comfortable, easy, non-threatening, available. The people pleaser registers the need and responds to it instinctively, because need is a trigger for the accommodation reflex. And the person doing the needing experiences the people pleaser as ideal. Finally, someone who gets me, someone who is there for me, someone who doesn't push back or challenge or ask for things in return. The incompatibility only reveals itself later, when the people pleaser, exhausted and resentful, begins to withdraw, when the taker, faced with diminishing supply, escalates their demands or exits for fresher accommodation, and the people pleaser, who chose this person for reasons they didn't understand, experiences the ending as further evidence of their fundamental unlovability. The Stoics would point out that this cycle is entirely predictable given the initial conditions, and changing it requires changing the initial conditions. When you develop clear limits, when you begin to hold the iron fence, when you allow your genuine personality, including its difficult aspects, to be visible from the beginning of relationships, you change who is drawn to you, not instantly, not without discomfort, but over time. The person who is specifically looking for unlimited accommodation will find you exhausting and move on. And the person who is interested in genuine relationship, who wants to connect with an actual person rather than a service provider, who is capable of reciprocity and genuinely curious about who you are, that person will find you fascinating, because you will be someone specific and real and impossible to confuse with anyone else. Marcus was in his third year of the work when he had a realization about his romantic relationships that was perhaps the most confronting of all the things he had seen in himself. He had been single for 2 years, not unhappily single, not the brittle single of someone suppressing loneliness, but genuinely comfortable with his own company for perhaps the first time. And in that solitude, he had occasion to look back with clear eyes at the relationships he had been in, 3 significant ones over 15 years, and what he saw, with the hindsight that transformation allows, was a pattern so consistent it might as well have been a formula. In every relationship, he had been the one who accommodated more, who compromised more, who needed less reassurance while providing more, who was more patient, more available, more willing to shrink his preferences to fit the shape of what the other person needed. And in every relationship, the other person had been, in their own way, someone who needed a great deal and gave back a great deal less. Not bad people, not malicious, but people who, when offered an infinite supply of accommodation, had taken it, because that is what people do when the supply is infinite, not out of cruelty, out of the entirely predictable human tendency to accept what is offered without questioning the terms. He had not questioned the terms. He had been too afraid that questioning would mean losing, and so he had kept the supply infinite. And when it eventually ran out, when he had given so much for so long that there was genuinely nothing left, the relationships had ended, and he had told himself the story of someone who was too nice for people who couldn't appreciate it. The honest story was different. The honest story was that he had never offered a person the authentic experience of him. He had offered a service, and services, when they fail, do not produce grief. They produce the mild irritation of a subscription that didn't renew. No one had ever lost him because no one had ever had him. This realization, sitting in his apartment in year 3, was perhaps the most painful thing of all, because it meant that the loneliness he had experienced across 15 years of relationships was not despite his niceness. It was because of it. His niceness had been a form of hiding, and the hiding had kept him, despite every appearance of connection, profoundly, structurally alone. He cried about it, if we are being honest with each other here. And then he picked up his journal and wrote, in the language of someone learning to be real, "I am willing to be seen, terrifying as it is. I am willing to let someone encounter the actual me, with all the complexity and the difficulty and the sharp edges, and see what happens when the experience is genuine, rather than managed." What you attract when you become real is different from what you attracted before, and what you attract when you become real is worth waiting for. Chapter 10. The Logos. The Stoic case for saying exactly what you mean. There is a concept in Stoic philosophy called the Logos. It is one of the most complex and multifaceted ideas in their entire system, but for our purposes here, I want to focus on one specific aspect of it that applies directly to the people-pleasing dynamic. The Logos, in the Stoic understanding, is the rational principle that underlies all of reality, the organizing intelligence of the cosmos, and the capacity that makes human beings unique among animals in the Stoic view is our capacity to participate in that rational principle, to reason, to deliberate, to choose our words and actions based on genuine reflection rather than instinct or compulsion. When you lie in the Stoic understanding, you are acting against the Logos, not in a religious sense, in a rational sense. You are choosing unreason over reason, construction over reality, performance over truth, and people-pleasing, as we have been establishing throughout this book, is a form of lying, not always in the obvious sense of saying things you know to be false, but in the deeper sense of consistently presenting a version of reality, a version of yourself, that is constructed rather than actual. Every yes that means no is a small lie. Every performed agreement that conceals genuine disagreement is a small lie. Every apology for something you are not sorry for is a small lie. Every accommodation that conceals resentment is a small lie. These small lies accumulate. They accumulate in your relationships, creating a skewed picture of who you are that other people are working from and making decisions based on. They accumulate in your body, creating the tension and exhaustion that chronic people-pleasers experience. They accumulate in your sense of self, creating the foggy uncertainty about who you actually are that makes the question, "What do you want?" so hard to answer. The Stoics were not naive about social tact. They were not arguing that every thought should be spoken, that every opinion should be volunteered, that all social nuance should be abandoned in favor of blunt honesty. Seneca and Marcus and Epictetus all wrote about the importance of choosing the right moment and the right words for honest speech. Social context matters, relationship context matters, but there is an enormous difference between tactical wisdom about how and when to speak honestly and the systematic suppression of honest expression as a survival strategy. The first is wisdom, the second is cowardice, and the Stoics would call it exactly that, not cruelly, but clearly, cowardice. not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that hides behind consideration for others as a way of avoiding the discomfort of being real. The practice they would prescribe is what I will call the precision of expression. It works like this. Before you speak, particularly in high-stakes social moments, you ask yourself, does what I am about to say accurately represent what I actually think and feel? If yes, say it. If no, ask yourself what is actually true and find a way to say that instead, not necessarily with more words, often with fewer, but with accuracy. This sounds simple. In practice, for people who have spent decades smoothing and softening and managing, it requires significant practice. The conditioned response is to round off the sharp edges before speaking, to pre-process every thought through the filter of what will be received well, to produce speech that is designed to be non-threatening rather than true. The precision of expression does not mean abandoning kindness. Kind words can be true words. The question is whether the truth is being sacrificed for the kindness, or whether the kindness is being offered alongside the truth. I love you and I can't come to this event is kind and true. I love you and of course I'll come when you desperately don't want to is kind and false. The first respects the other person. The second infantilizes them, deciding on their behalf that they cannot handle your honest preference, and in doing so, it deprives them of the actual you, of the relationship that could exist if it were built on real information, logos, reality, truth, the foundation on which everything real is built. Marcus had a conversation in year 3 with a colleague he had been quietly resenting for the better part of 2 years, a man who consistently took credit for collaborative work, who positioned himself as the originator of ideas that had been developed jointly, who did it so smoothly and confidently that challenging it always felt disproportionate. The old Marcus would have continued to absorb it, would have told himself it didn't really matter, that the work was its own reward, that making an issue of it would create unnecessary conflict. The new Marcus, drawing on months of practice, chose a specific moment, a moment when it was just the two of them, and said, clearly and without aggression, I've noticed that in our presentations, the work we've done together tends to get attributed primarily to you. I don't think that's accurate or fair, and I'd like it to change. The colleague went quiet, then defensive, then, after a pause, genuine. You're right, he said. I've been doing that. I didn't fully realize how consistently I was doing it. I'm going to fix that. The conversation that Marcus had been dreading for 2 years, the one he had decided could never happen without destroying everything, took 11 minutes. And on the other side of it, the relationship, which had been superficially pleasant and deeply corroded, became something cleaner and more genuinely collegial than it had ever been. Truth is not always welcome in the moment, but it is almost always better for the relationship in the long run. The logos is the principle that holds everything together. Speak from it. Chapter 11, The Midnight Hour. What happens to the people pleaser alone in the dark? This chapter does not have a historical example. This chapter is just for you, because there is a specific experience that people pleasers have, one that nobody talks about in the daylight, one that tends to arrive in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, when the performance is over and the audience is asleep, and there is nothing between you and yourself. You know what I'm talking about. The hour when the day's accommodations replay themselves without softening, when the yes you said that cost you surfaces with its full price tag, when you remember the thing you wanted to say that you didn't say, when the chronic low-grade resentment that daylight keeps manageable swells into something that feels uncomfortably close to rage or grief or both. When the question comes, uninvited, is this it? Is this the life I'm actually living? The midnight hour is real, and it is the most honest hour in the people pleaser's life. It is the hour when the unconscious can no longer be overridden by social performance, when the body, in the absence of anyone to manage, finally says what it actually thinks. What it usually says is this: I am tired of this. I am so tired of being everyone's everything and no one's first choice. I am tired of giving and never feeling given to. I am tired of being liked for something that isn't me. I am tired of managing, monitoring, adjusting, smoothing, performing. I am tired. The Stoics would call this the voice of the neglected self. Not a pathology, not a dysfunction, a signal. The midnight hour is information. It is the part of you that knows the difference between how you are living and how you could be living, and it is the part of you that will not let you forget it forever, however hard you try during the daylight hours. The Stoic recommendation in this territory is not to suppress the midnight voice, not to argue it down with optimism or distract it with productivity. The recommendation is to listen to it, to use the honesty of those dark hours, not to spiral into shame or despair, but to accurately inventory what is true, to let the midnight hour be the most honest conversation you have with yourself all week, and then to carry that honesty back into the daylight, not as performance, not as grievance, as commitment, the commitment to close the gap, to live incrementally as the person the midnight voice knows you to be. Marcus had many midnight hours. He wrote about them obliquely in his meditations, the passages that address exhaustion and the temptation to simply sink into compliance because resistance requires energy he sometimes didn't have. And in those passages, he does not pretend to heroic indifference. He admits the weariness, he sits with it. And then, in almost every case, he returns to the same question: what does the work require of me? Not what does my comfort require, not what does everyone's approval require. What does the actual work, the work of being a genuine person, of living with integrity, require? And that question, asked honestly in the midnight hour, tends to produce an answer that is inconvenient and necessary and right. There is another aspect of the midnight hour that I want to name, because the tiredness is only part of what arrives in those dark, quiet spaces. The other thing that arrives, the thing that is harder to sit with than the tiredness, is the grief. People pleasers grieve at night, not always with tears, sometimes just with the particular heaviness of a chest that has been holding something too long, sometimes with the specific quality of silence that follows the replay of a moment in which you said nothing when you needed to say something, sometimes with the faint but persistent awareness that you have been playing a character in your own life instead of living it. The grief is real. I am not going to rush past it, or wrap it in positivity, or tell you that the Stoic thing to do is simply refuse to feel it. The Stoics were not people who didn't feel. They felt everything. They simply trained themselves not to be controlled by what they felt. There is a fundamental difference between feeling grief and being imprisoned by it. Feel the grief. Let it move through you honestly, and then let Seneca ask you the question he asked himself in his most vulnerable letters. What has this cost me, and is it still costing me now? The grief over time already lost is legitimate. The decision to let time continue to be lost in the same way, out of grief over the time already gone, is not legitimate. It is, as Seneca would say, compounding the loss. The midnight hour is also, in its honesty, a planning space. Not tactical planning, not the anxious to-do list that insomnia sometimes produces, something deeper. The kind of clarity that only comes when the noise of the day has completely subsided and the only voice left is the one that has always known the truth. In that clarity, things become obvious, that daytime manages to obscure. What do I actually want my life to look like? Not in 10 years, not as an abstract aspiration, in the next week, in the next conversation, in the next moment when the familiar pressure arrives and the familiar choice between honest and managed presents itself. What, in the stillness of this actual night, do I want to choose? The midnight hour is not your enemy. It is your most honest advisor. Listen to it. Let it tell you what to change. And when the morning comes, and it always comes, carry the truth you found in the dark back into the light with you. Change it. One small thing. Today, Chapter 12. The Field of Battle. Facing the people who depend on your people-pleasing, there will be resistance. Let me be absolutely clear about this, because anyone who promises you otherwise is lying. When you begin to change the pattern, when you start holding limits that were previously soft, saying no to requests that were previously reflexively accepted, expressing genuine opinions rather than managed ones, there will be people in your life who resist this, who push back, who are, to put it plainly, upset. And some of them will use every tool available to them to get you to go back to how you were. Guilt. I thought you cared about me. Shame. You've really changed, and not for the better. Comparison. You used to be so much easier to talk to. History. After everything I've done for you. Appeals to relationship. I just don't understand you anymore. These are not necessarily malicious. Most people who do this are not conscious manipulators. They are people who have built their relationship with you on a particular set of conditions, and those conditions are changing, and they are experiencing genuine distress about the change. The distress is real, even if the response to it is not your responsibility to fix. The Stoics had a term for this kind of pressure. It was part of what they called the common obstacles to virtue. Not just internal obstacles, your own fear and habit and conditioning, but external ones, the people and circumstances that push back against growth, because growth disrupts the existing order. Marcus Aurelius faced this at the level of empire. The bureaucratic systems, the entrenched interests, the advisors who had built their influence on his need for their counsel, all of them pushed back against his attempts to act with genuine integrity rather than political calculation. He wrote about it with a kind of grim humor, acknowledging that doing the right thing was perpetually complicated by the fact that doing the right thing was perpetually inconvenient for someone. Your field of battle is smaller, but the principle is identical. The people who benefit most from your people-pleasing will be the ones who push hardest against your change. And they will have an advantage. They know your history. They know the arguments that have moved you before. They know the emotional levers. They have been pulling those levers successfully for years, and they will pull them again. The Stoic defense against this is not emotional armor. It is not detachment in the sense of not caring. It is clarity. Clarity about what is actually happening, clarity about why it is happening, and clarity about what your actual position is and why you hold it. When someone says you've changed, the non-Stoic response is defensive, or apologetic, or explanatory, a long justification of the transformation, an attempt to bring the other person along, to explain yourself sufficiently that they can approve of the change. The Stoic response is simpler. Yes, I have. Full stop. Not with coldness, with honesty. Yes, you have changed. The change is intentional. You do not require their approval of it. Their discomfort is real, and you can acknowledge it. I know this is different from how things used to be between us. I'm still here and I still care about you, but I can't be who I used to be. I'm not sure I ever actually was that person. This kind of clarity does not always produce immediate reconciliation. Sometimes it produces a period of difficulty. Sometimes that difficulty lasts a while. The people who depended most heavily on your accommodation may go through something that resembles anger, then bargaining, then, eventually, if the relationship is genuine at its core, acceptance, and some will not accept it, and you will grieve them, amor fati. But many will, and what you will find on the other side of their acceptance is something remarkable, a relationship with genuinely better terms, one in which they see you more clearly and relate to you more honestly and appreciate you for the first time for who you actually are. There is a specific technique for the field of battle that I want to offer. The Stoics called it the prepared response. Before entering a high-stakes interaction where pressure is predictable, you prepare yourself, not with a script, but with clarity. You know what you think, you know what you are holding to, you know what you will and will not give ground on. And you enter the conversation not anxious and reactive, but settled and clear. This does not mean you stop listening. Genuine openness to new information and genuine argument is always appropriate. But there is a difference between a mind that is open and a mind that is a door with no lock. The door with no lock is easy to push open. The open mind with a lock can be entered by genuine invitation. Know what you're holding. Hold it. Be warm. Be honest. Be unmovable on the things that matter. Chapter 13. The Final Philosophy. What remains when the performance is over? There is a man who now exists. He is Marcus. He is 43 years old. He went back to work 4 years ago with something changed inside him, something small and decisive, the size of a single moment of refusal. He is not easy. He will tell you that himself, without apology, in fact with a kind of quiet satisfaction. He is not the man everyone likes. He is the man some people respect, and some people find challenging, and a few people, the right ones, genuinely love. Not the performance of him. His relationship with his father is the most honest it has been in their shared lifetime. They argue sometimes, properly argue, with genuine positions on both sides and genuine resolution or genuine respectful disagreement at the end. His father told him recently, not easily, with the difficulty of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that he was proud of him, not for what he had accomplished, for who he had become. He has fewer friends than he did 4 years ago. The ones that remain are the ones who know him, not the ones who know the agreeable, available, reliable version. The ones who know the actual person, with the sharp opinions and the clear limits, and the occasional irritability and the genuine, considered, unconditional warmth that exists underneath all of it. The warmth that was always there and that is at last offered freely rather than dispensed anxiously. He sleeps better. This sounds trivial. It is not trivial. A person who is no longer managing the dissonance between their public face and their private truth no longer has to process that dissonance in the night. The midnight hours are quieter, not perfect. The inner work is ongoing and probably permanent, but quieter. He still says yes to things. He says yes to more things now in some ways than he did before, because the yes is real, because every yes comes from genuine desire and genuine capacity rather than from fear and compulsion. Because when he says yes, the person receiving it knows they are receiving something genuine, and that makes the yes matter in a way that the old reflexive yes never did. He found, over 4 years of this work, something that the Stoics would recognize immediately, and that he could not have articulated when he began. He found himself, not a dramatic discovery, not a revelation with lights and music, a gradual, incremental, sometimes painful excavation of a person who had been buried under decades of performance, a person with particular tastes, particular strengths, particular ways of engaging with the world that are distinctly and irreducibly his, a person who cannot be confused with anyone else's convenience. The seventh Stoic lesson, the one that contains and integrates all the others, the one that Marcus Aurelius returned to in his private meditations more than any other, is this: the most important work of your life is the work of becoming who you actually are, not who others need you to be, not who it would be convenient for you to be, not the version of yourself that generates the most approval, or the least friction, or the most widespread liking. Who you actually are. This is a work that has no completion date, no graduation ceremony, no moment at which you are fully done and can rest in your achieved authenticity forever. It is an ongoing practice, a daily renewal, a commitment that must be made and remade in the thousand small choices that constitute a life. But here is what that work gives you, that nothing else can give you in the same way. It gives you yourself, and yourself, inhabited fully and with genuine courage, is the most extraordinary thing you will ever possess. It is the one thing that is entirely, irrevocably, absolutely yours. No one can take it. No disapproval can diminish it. No failed relationship or changed circumstance or opinion of any crowd on earth can touch the core of a person who has done this work. That is what the Stoics found in the tent, at war, writing to himself, in the slave quarters, with a broken leg, calmly telling his master what would happen, in letters to a friend, writing about how to die well, which is to say, how to live well. They found it in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. You can find it in yours. Chapter 14, The Resurrection, the person you've been waiting to become. We have come a long way together, from that apartment on a Tuesday night, from the stolen idea and the silent smile and the question that finally refused to stay buried, from the first terrifying no and the shaking hands and the world that did not end, from the father's fury and the friend's drift and the colleague's honest reckoning, from midnight hours and iron fences and the logos and the love of a fate that includes being disliked. We have come a long way, and now I want to give you the ending, not the ending of Marcus's story. His story, like yours, is ongoing, unfinished, in progress. Not the ending of the philosophical argument. The argument, like all genuine philosophical inquiry, spirals back on itself and continues forever. The ending I want to give you is the ending of the version of you who began this audiobook, the version who said yes when you meant no, who smiled through the theft of your ideas, who apologized for existing, who performed pleasantness until it became a second skin, and then forgot that the skin was a costume. That version of you has a natural endpoint, not a forced one, not a violent one, just a natural conclusion, the way winter has a natural conclusion. It ends because it has served its purpose. It protected you when you needed protection. It carried you through circumstances where softness was the only available armor. It did what it was designed to do, and now you don't need it anymore. What you need now is the version of yourself that has been waiting on the other side of all that performance. I want to say something about waiting, about the particular quality of the self that has been patient through all the years of performance. There is a concept in Stoic philosophy about the nature of the ruling faculty, the hegemonikon, the central part of the human mind that observes, judges, and chooses. The Stoics believed this faculty was, in its essence, uncorruptible, that it could be ignored, suppressed, distracted, overridden, but not destroyed, not permanently silenced, because it is the part of us that is most essentially us, and it knows the truth even when we are loudest in our lies about it. The person you have been waiting to become has not been waiting passively. They have been active, present, watching from behind the performance, with a patience that is, honestly, more than you deserved, noting every moment of self-betrayal with a precision that explains every midnight hour you've ever had, sending up signals through anxiety and exhaustion and the particular ache of being misunderstood that have been trying to get your attention for years. You finally heard them, or you are in the process of hearing them, which is why you are here. And what that waiting self has been waiting to tell you is not complicated. It is in fact very simple. You are allowed to be here, not conditionally, not as long as you are useful enough and agreeable enough and sufficiently undemanding. Here, fully, as the entire person you are, with the preferences that are inconvenient and the opinions that create friction and the needs that require someone else to also show up, and the imperfections that don't fit the generous, reliable, selfless image you've been performing, all of it, here, allowed. The Stoics would describe this person in terms of virtue, which for them was not a moral abstraction, but a concrete description of a human being functioning at their full capacity, a person of genuine courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly in the presence of it, of genuine justice, not just fairness but honest engagement in all relationships, of genuine wisdom, the capacity to see clearly and respond rightly, of genuine temperance, the self-possession that allows you to be neither pushed nor pulled away from your actual center. This is not a description of a saint. This is a description of a person who has done the work of honesty, of self-examination, of holding limits, of saying what you mean, of allowing others to see you clearly and discovering that the clarity, frightening as it is also liberation. Now here is what I want to say about the word resurrection that I chose for this chapter's title. Resurrection is a word with religious connotations, and I am using it deliberately but not religiously. I am using it because it is the most accurate word for what happens when a person stops people-pleasing in the deep structural way we have been discussing. It is not improvement. It is not growth in the conventional sense. It is more like coming back to life after a kind of living death. The people-pleaser is alive technically, moving through the world, engaging with others, working, relating, experiencing. But there is a specific quality of aliveness that they have been without, sometimes for decades, and it is the quality that makes all the other aspects of being alive actually land. The quality of genuine presence, of being fully, vulnerably, honestly in your own experience. When Marcus was in the depths of his people-pleasing years, he sometimes described a feeling of watching his own life from a slight remove, as though he were observing a very convincing performance of a person named Marcus, doing things that a person named Marcus was supposed to do, rather than actually being that person and actually doing those things. The performance was so practiced, so smooth, so utterly habitual, that it no longer required his conscious participation. He had automated it, and the automation had freed him up from the labor of self-betrayal while depriving him of the only thing that made life actually worth living. Being real, being in the room, being present to what was actually happening rather than managing what appeared to be happening. The resurrection is the return of presence, and presence, once you have experienced it after a long absence, feels almost unbearably vivid. The world is louder, colors seem slightly brighter, emotions, both painful and pleasurable, arrive without the buffering that the performance used to provide. You are not protected from your own experience anymore. You are in it, fully, rawly, honestly in it. This can feel, at first, like sensitivity, like having lost the calluses you had developed over years, and in a sense that is exactly what it is. The calluses were protecting you, but they were also preventing you from feeling the texture of your own life. And the texture of your own life, the roughness of genuine difficulty, and the smoothness of genuine joy, and the complexity of genuine love, and the clean, sharp edge of honest disagreement, that texture is what being alive actually consists of. You deserve to feel your own life. I want to tell you what that liberation feels like, not as a promise, as a report from the other side of it, from everyone who has ever done this work and written about it, or spoken about it, or looked back on it, with the perspective that only time gives. It feels like breathing, not the shallow, managed breath of someone monitoring their own presentation, the deep, unself-conscious breath of someone who is simply alive and present and not performing anything. It feels like a room that was full of furniture and is now open, spacious, full of air and light. You can move freely in it. You can change direction without knocking into the careful arrangements you had made. You can be still in it without maintaining anything. It feels like the exact opposite of loneliness, which is not the presence of many people, but the presence of genuine contact. The ability to be known, to have your edges touch other people's edges and have both edges still exist afterward. To be in a room with another person and not be managing them, not be performing for them, not be monitoring their response to your presentation of yourself, but simply being with them, present, real, alive. It feels, in a word that is too small for what it actually is, like freedom. And then it feels like more than that. It feels like the beginning of your actual life. Because here is the secret that everything in this audiobook has been building toward. The secret that Epictetus understood from a chain, that Marcus understood from the weight of empire, that Seneca understood from the shadow of execution, that you are going to understand from the particular circumstances of your own unrepeatable, irreplaceable, extraordinary life. You were never the performance. You were always the performer. And the performer, when they finally step out from behind the mask, when they finally stand in the full light of their own reality, uncurated and unapologetic and genuinely, fiercely, joyfully themselves, is more interesting, more beautiful, more valuable, more deeply and truly worthy of love than any performance could ever be. The mask was never the face. The face, your face, was always there, waiting, I want to talk about what happens to the people around you when you complete this resurrection. Some of them, as we have discussed, will not be able to handle it. They were there for the performance. The performance was the entire relationship, and without it, there is nothing between you. Their discomfort with your authenticity is real. Their departure, when it comes, is painful. But it is also, ultimately, a clarification. It is the relationship telling you, in the most unambiguous language available, what it actually was. But there is another category of people, the ones who have known, somewhere underneath the surface of your performance, that there was more to you, the ones who occasionally glimpsed the real person and found themselves drawn to them and then watched the performance snap back into place like a window closing. These people have been waiting, often unconsciously, for the window to stay open. When it does, what happens between you and them is remarkable. Conversations deepen. Jokes land differently because they are made by someone who is actually present. Conflicts resolve more honestly because you are both engaging with the actual situation rather than managing the impression it creates. Love, if there is love between you, becomes something that can be named directly rather than hinted at obliquely. Friendship becomes genuine rather than transactional. The entire register of the relationship shifts from performance and management to contact and reality. And contact, genuine contact between two real people, is one of the rarest and most precious things available in a human life. You have been depriving yourself of it. You have been depriving the people you love of it. The performance was kind, but it was also a theft. It stole from the people who cared about you the experience of actually being with you. It gave them a wonderful, agreeable, available substitute, but it withheld the thing they actually wanted, which was the real you, with the complexity and the difficulty and the warmth that is 10 times more moving when it is genuine rather than performed. Give it to them now. Give it to yourself first, because you have been the most deprived person in every room you have ever entered, the one who smiled the most and was present the least, the one who gave the most and received the least, the one who was liked by the most people and known by the fewest. Be known. Take the risk. Now take it off. Not today if you're not ready. Not in the dramatic all-at-once way that makes for good movie moments but rarely produces lasting change. In your time, at your pace, with the patience and the courage and the daily recommitment that genuine transformation requires. But take it off. A little today, a little more tomorrow, and the day after that, a little more again, until the morning comes when you look in the mirror before the world gets to you, before the email and the requests and the social pressure and the performance demands, and you see someone looking back at you that you recognize, not from the years of the mask, from earlier, from before all of it, from some younger, realer, more essential version of you that never fully left. That person is who you have always been. They are who you are still capable of being. They are worth every difficult conversation, every held limit, every moment of discomfort, every relationship that found its true form, and everyone that couldn't survive the truth. They are worth everything. You are worth everything. And it has taken entirely too long for someone to look you in the eye and tell you so. Consider this that moment. Now go live like you believe it. The silence after the last words of an audiobook is always strange. It is the silence of a person sitting with what they have just absorbed, of things settling into new configurations, of the mind quietly rearranging furniture in rooms that have been cluttered for years. Sit in that silence. Let it do its work. And while it does, let me tell you one last thing. The Stoics did not believe in a sudden, dramatic transformation of the self. They believed in practice, in daily return to the principles, in the gentle but persistent correction of deviation when you notice it. They believed that philosophy was not a subject to be studied, but a way of life to be lived, and that the living of it was imperfect by nature, because human beings are imperfect by nature, and that the imperfection was not a reason to stop, but a reason to continue. You will fall back into old patterns. There will be days, probably not too far from now, when the pressure is high and the stakes feel enormous, and the path of least resistance is the path you have traveled 10,000 times before, the path of the nod and the smile and the yes that costs you something, and you will take it because you are human, because the grooves of old behavior run deep, because courage is not a switch you flip once and leave in the on position. It is a muscle that has to be exercised, and sometimes cramps and sometimes fails and then is exercised again. When that happens, do not despair. Do not interpret the relapse as evidence that you have not changed or cannot change, or that this entire journey was an illusion. That is the people-pleasing mind trying one more trick to keep you where it knows you are safe. The relapse is not failure. The relapse is data. It tells you where the pattern is still strong, where the old fear is still running its ancient program, and that information is useful. Examine it, learn from it, and then return. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, returns to the same principles over and over and over again, not because he forgot them, but because he needed to be reminded of them. Daily, constantly, because living rightly is not a state you achieve and maintain effortlessly. It is a practice you undertake and renew endlessly. He wrote, "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." He was not describing enemies. He was describing the circumstances of life, the ordinary, unavoidable, sometimes challenging human beings who would press against his patience and his limits and his commitment to his own values. And he was preparing himself, not with armor, with presence, with the decision, made fresh each morning, to remain exactly who he had decided to be regardless of what the day brought. Make that decision, fresh each morning, not as a burden, as a gift you give yourself before the day has a chance to ask anything of you. Today I am going to be real. Today I am going to say what I mean. Today I am going to hold what needs to be held. Today I am going to be in whatever small and imperfect and genuinely human way is available to me, myself. 7 lessons, 14 chapters, 1 life, yours. When you are ready, when the silence has said everything it needs to say, take 1 step. Not 100 steps, not a transformation. A step. Say 1 thing you mean. Hold 1 position under pressure. Pause before 1 yes. Just 1, and see what happens on the other side of it. The Stoics will be with you. They always have been. They were just waiting for you to be ready to meet them.